We are taught that the 1980s debt crisis in Latin America was a tragic accident of economics. We are told it was bad management, corruption, and oil shocks that destroyed an entire generation. But this is the version of history written for bankers. It is the version that ignores the cold, hard mechanics of financial liquidation. If you want to understand why Latin America lost 40 years of development, why inequality exploded, and why entire nations are still trapped in poverty today, you have to look past the IMF reports. You have to look at a room in Washington, D.C. on a Saturday night in October 1979. You have to find the moment when a central banker raised his hand and signed a death warrant for 300 million people. It was not a weapon. It was an interest rate. This is the story of the Volcker Shock. It is the story of how the United States Federal Reserve, in a desperate attempt to kill inflation at home, accidentally triggered the largest wealth extraction operation in modern history. It is the story of how Latin America borrowed money to build the future and woke up to find they had purchased their own execution. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand the world as it existed in the early 1970s. The global financial system had just been shattered. In 1971, President Richard Nixon destroyed the Bretton Woods Agreement. He took the US dollar off the gold standard. This meant that for the first time in history, the entire world was operating on pure paper money, backed by nothing but trust. At the same time, oil prices exploded. In 1973, OPEC launched an oil embargo. The price of crude went from $3 a barrel to $12 almost overnight. Arab nations were suddenly drowning in cash. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Gulf states were collecting billions of dollars every month. But they had a problem. They could not spend it fast enough. Their populations were small. Their economies were tiny. They needed somewhere to park this ocean of petrodollars. So they deposited the money in the largest banks in the world: Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank. These banks now had vaults overflowing with cash. But banks do not make money by holding deposits. They make money by lending. And they needed borrowers desperately. This is where Latin America enters the story. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Venezuela were hungry for development. They wanted to build highways, dams, steel mills, and oil refineries. They wanted to escape poverty and join the modern world. The banks came to them with an offer that seems too good to refuse: loans at incredibly low interest rates. 6%, 7%, sometimes even lower. The banks told them, borrow now, build your future, pay us back later. But there was a clause buried in every contract, a clause that almost no one paid attention to. The interest rates were not fixed. They were variable. The loans were pegged to something called the London Interbank Offered Rate, or LIBOR. The contract said you will pay us prime plus 2%, or LIBOR plus 1.5%. The rate could float. It could adjust. But in 1975, when Brazil borrowed $10 billion, inflation was high and real interest rates were actually negative. Borrowing money was almost free. The bankers assured the Latin American finance ministers that rates would stay low forever. They said that inflation would erode the real value of the debt. They said it was the smartest move a developing country could make. Between 1973 and 1979, Latin America borrowed $327 billion, almost all of it at floating rates. They built cities of steel and glass. They constructed the largest hydroelectric dams in the world, but they had built their future on top of the Trapdoor. And in Washington, look at Latin America in 1978, and you will see the image of triumph. Brazil had become the 8th largest economy in the world. Sao Paulo was a forest of skyscrapers. The Itaipu Dam on the border with Paraguay was the largest hydroelectric project on Earth. It produced more electricity than 12 nuclear power plants. Mexican oil production had exploded. They had discovered massive reserves in the Bay of Campeche. President José López Portillo stood before his people and declared that Mexico's only problem now was how to manage abundance. He said they must learn to administrate their prosperity. Argentina had built a subway system that rivaled Paris. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America. Venezuela was so rich from oil that they were lending money to other countries. They had nationalized their oil industry and created PDVSA, one of the most powerful energy companies in the world. The governments told their people that they had broken free from colonial dependence. They said the era of exploitation was over. They were building industries that would last forever. But if you looked at the ledgers beneath the marble floors of these new buildings, you would see a very different picture. You would see that $327 billion in debt was hanging over the continent like a guillotine blade. and the rope holding it up was made of variable interest rates. The finance ministers knew this, but they had convinced themselves of a beautiful lie. They believed that inflation would save them. Here is how the logic worked. If you borrow $100 million at 8% interest, you owe $8 million a year. But if inflation is running at 10%, the real value of your debt is shrinking. Your exports become more expensive. Your revenue grows. The debt becomes easier to pay. This is called negative real interest rates. And in the 1970s, this was the reality. Inflation was eating away at the value of money faster than interest could accumulate. Borrowers were being paid to borrow. The Latin American economists had run the numbers. They had built sophisticated models. They had calculated that as long as inflation stayed above interest rates, the debt was sustainable. In fact, it was profitable. Brazil's finance minister, Mario Henrique Simonsen, had warned that the floating rate loans were dangerous, but he was overruled by the development planners who said that growth would outpace debt service. The Mexican technocrats believed the same thing. They looked at their oil reserves and said, "We are sitting on an ocean of wealth. We can borrow against the future because the future is guaranteed." But there was a deeper delusion at work. These countries were not just betting on inflation. They were betting that the United States would never, ever raise interest rates high enough to kill inflation. They were betting that the Federal Reserve cared more about global stability than domestic price control. They were betting that America would not burn down the developing world to save itself. This was not an insane bet. For decades, the United States had positioned itself as the leader of the free world. It had created institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, specifically to stabilize the global economy. American presidents gave speeches about partnership and development. They talked about lifting nations out of poverty. The developing world believed that the U.S. had a vested interest in their success. After all, if Latin America collapsed, American banks would lose hundreds of billions of dollars. If Brazil defaulted, Citibank would go bankrupt. The logic seemed airtight. The Americans would never let that happen, so the loans kept flowing. In 1917 alone, Mexico borrowed another $20 billion. They used it to expand Pemex, the state oil company. They built refineries and pipelines. Brazil borrowed another $15 billion. They poured it into Petrobras and Vale, their mining giant. The architects and engineers were busy. The cranes never stopped moving. But none of them were watching the calendar. None of them were watching the inflation numbers in the United States. By the summer of 1979, American inflation had hit 13.3%. Gasoline prices had doubled. The dollar was collapsing. American citizens were rioting at gas stations. The political pressure on the Federal Reserve was unbearable. And in August 1979, President Jimmy Carter made a decision that would seal the fate of an entire continent. He appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker had one mandate: kill inflation, no matter the cost. October 6, 1979. A Saturday evening in Washington, D.C., Paul Volcker called an emergency meeting of the Federal Reserve Board. This was unprecedented. The Federal Reserve almost never met on weekends. The fact that Volcker had summoned the governors on a Saturday night sent a signal to the financial world that something catastrophic was about to happen. The meeting was held in secret. No press, no announcement, just 7 men in a room deciding the fate of the global economy. Volcker was a giant of a man, 6 feet 7 inches tall. He walked into the room smoking a cheap cigar and carrying a single briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a plan that would destroy the largest wealth transfer operation in modern history. He told the board that inflation had become an existential threat to the United States. He said that if they did not act immediately, the dollar would collapse. He said that the American people had lost faith in their currency. Foreign governments were dumping dollars and buying gold. The price of gold had gone from $35 an ounce in 1971 to over $400. The world was rejecting American paper. Volcker said there was only one solution: raise interest rates so high that it would strangle inflation to death. Make borrowing so expensive that businesses would stop expanding. Make money so scarce that people would stop spending. Deliberately trigger a recession to reset the system. One of the governors asked, "What will this do to unemployment?" Volcker responded, "It will go up." Another governor asked, "What will this do to the developing countries that have borrowed from our banks?" Volcker paused. Then he said, "They will have to adjust." At midnight on October 6, 1979, the Federal Reserve announced the new policy. The federal funds rate, which had been hovering around 11%, would now be allowed to rise as high as necessary. There would be no ceiling. The market would decide. Within weeks, interest rates hit 15%. By early 1980, they spiked to 20%, and in some short-term markets, they briefly touched 21.5%. This was the highest interest rate in American history. It was higher than rates during the Civil War, higher than rates during the Great Depression, higher than rates during any previous financial crisis. To understand what this meant for Latin America, you need to understand the mechanics of floating rate debt. Imagine you are the finance minister of Mexico. In 1978, you borrowed $10 billion at LIBOR plus 2%. At the time, LIBOR was 6%, so you were paying 8% interest. That means you owed $800 million a year in interest payments. Your oil exports were bringing in $30 billion a year. $800 million was manageable. It was less than 3% of your revenue. Now it is 1980. LIBOR has exploded to 18%. Your interest rate is now LIBOR plus 2, which equals 20%. You now owe $2 billion a year in interest. But your revenue has not doubled. In fact, because of the global recession triggered by Volcker's policy, demand for oil has collapsed. The price of oil is falling, your revenue is shrinking. Suddenly, debt service is consuming 7% of your entire national income, and you have not paid down a single dollar of the principal. You have only paid interest. This is the mechanical trigger. This is how a decision made in a room in Washington can liquidate a continent. But it gets worse, because Latin America did not just owe $10 billion, they owed $327 billion, and almost all of it was at floating rates. Brazil's debt service jumped from $4 billion a year to $12 billion a year. Argentina's payments tripled overnight. Venezuela, which had been lending money to other countries, suddenly could not pay its own bills. The numbers were simple and brutal. If interest rates are 8% and your economy is growing at 5%, you can manage the debt. But if interest rates are 20% and your economy is shrinking by 2%, the math becomes impossible. You are paying out more than you are taking in. You are bleeding to death, and there is no way to stop it. Because the loans were not callable. You cannot just pay them off early. You are locked in. The only option was to keep borrowing new money to pay the interest on the old money. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme, but it was not being run by criminals. It was being run by governments. And the people who designed this system, the bankers who wrote these contracts, knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that a variable rate clause was a trapdoor. They knew that if rates ever spiked, the borrower would be destroyed. But they did not care, because they believed they would be bailed out. Let me show you how this works with a story you can understand. Imagine you own a small shoe factory. You make leather boots. You employ 50 workers. You sell your boots to stores across the country and your business is growing. In 1975, you decide to expand. You want to buy new machines, hire more workers, and double your production. But you do not have the cash, so you go to a bank. The bank offers you a loan of $1 million. The interest rate is 8% per year. That means you will pay $80,000 in interest every year. You run the numbers. Your factory produces $500,000 in revenue per year. After paying your workers and buying materials, you have a profit of $150,000. Paying $80,000 in interest leaves you with $70,000. It is tight, but it works. You take the loan, you buy the machines, you hire the workers, your production doubles. Everything is going perfectly. But then something changes. The bank calls you and says, "We are raising your interest rate." You say, "What do you mean? We agreed on 8%. The bank says, "Read the contract." It says, "Variable rate." The rate is now 15%. Your annual interest payment just jumped from $80,000 to $150,000. But your profit is still $150,000. You are now paying every single dollar of profit just to service the debt. You have nothing left to pay yourself, nothing left to reinvest, nothing left to save. You are working just to pay the bank. But it gets worse, because the economy is in recession. People are buying fewer boots. Your revenue drops from $500,000 to $400,000. Your profit drops from $150,000 to $100,000, but your interest payment is still $150,000. You are now losing $50,000 a year. You cannot pay your workers. You cannot buy materials. You go back to the bank and say, "I need help." The bank says, "We can lend you another $200,000 to cover your losses." But the interest rate is now 20%. You take the loan because you have no choice. Now you owe $1.2 million. And your annual interest payment is $240,000. Your profit is $100,000. You are losing $140,000 a year. You borrow again and again. Each time the debt grows, each time the interest payment grows, but your revenue does not grow. Within 3 years, you owe $3 million. Your factory, which was worth $1 million, is now buried under a mountain of debt. You cannot sell it because no one will buy a business that loses money. You cannot pay it off because you do not have the cash. The only option left is bankruptcy. You close the factory. You fire the workers. The bank seizes your machines and sells them for pennies on the dollar. You are destroyed. This is exactly what happened to Latin America. But instead of a shoe factory, it was entire countries. Instead of $1 million, it was $327 billion. And instead of one business owner, it was 300 million people. The mechanics are identical. When your debt payments exceed your income, you are in a death spiral. You can only survive by borrowing more money. But borrowing more money increases your debt payments, which forces you to borrow even more. This is called the debt service ratio trap. And once you are in it, there is no mathematical way out. By 1982, Mexico was spending 40% of its government revenue just on interest payments. Not building schools, not paying doctors, not fixing roads, just paying interest to American banks. Brazil was spending 35%, Argentina was spending 50%. These countries were no longer sovereign nations. They were tributaries. They were paying a tax to foreign creditors that was higher than any tax their own people paid. But the cruelty of the system goes even deeper, because the money they borrowed had been used to build real things. Dams, factories, highways, power plants. These assets existed. They were generating value. The Itaipu Dam was producing electricity. The Mexican oil fields were pumping crude. The Brazilian steel mills were producing metal. But all of that value was being sucked out of the country to pay interest. The workers were still working. The machines were still running. But the profits were going to New York and London. It was extraction disguised as debt service, and the banks knew this. Internal memos from Citibank in 1981 showed that executives were aware Latin America could not pay. They knew the debt was unsustainable, but they also knew that if they stopped lending, the countries would default immediately. And if the countries defaulted, the banks would have to write off hundreds of billions of dollars in losses. So they made a calculation. Keep lending. Keep the illusion alive. Extend and pretend. Loan them just enough money to pay the interest on the old loans. This way, the debt stays on the books as a performing asset. The banks can tell their shareholders that everything is fine, and the governments of Latin America, terrified of being cut off from international capital markets, go along with it. They accept new loans with even worse terms just to avoid default. This is the paradox. The debtor is trapped because they fear the consequences of default. The creditor is trapped because they fear the consequences of admitting the debt is worthless. So both sides conspire to keep the charade going. But the human cost is catastrophic. Because while the banks and governments are playing this game, real people are suffering. Hospitals run out of medicine. Schools close. Infrastructure crumbles. Inflation explodes because the governments print money to cover the gap between revenue and expenses. The currency collapses. Savings are wiped out. And an entire generation is sacrificed on the altar of debt service. The shoe factory goes bankrupt. The shoemaker loses everything. But the bank gets bailed out by the government. And there is a moment in every debt crisis where government must make a choice. Do we pay the foreign banks or do we feed our people? Do we service the debt or do we fund the hospitals? Do we protect our credit rating or do we protect our citizens? You would think the answer is obvious, but it never is, because there is a psychological weapon the creditors use that is more powerful than any army. It is called the fear of exclusion. Let me explain how this works. In 1982, the International Monetary Fund sent missions to every country in Latin America. These were teams of economists, lawyers, and accountants. They arrived in Mexico City, in Brasilia, in Buenos Aires, in Caracas. They set up offices in the finance ministries. They demanded access to every government ledger, every budget document, every financial statement. They were not there to help. They were there to enforce. The IMF presented each government with the same ultimatum. If you want access to new loans, you must accept our conditions. You must cut government spending. You must eliminate food subsidies. You must raise taxes. You must freeze wages. You must privatize state-owned companies. You must open your markets to foreign goods. And most importantly, you must continue paying your debts. If you refuse, we will declare you in default. And if you are in default, no bank in the world will lend to you. You will be cut off from international capital markets. Your currency will become worthless. Your economy will collapse. This was the script, and every finance minister in Latin America heard it. Now, here is where the psychology gets interesting. The finance ministers were not stupid. They knew that the IMF conditions would cause massive suffering. They knew that cutting food subsidies would lead to hunger. They knew that freezing wages during hyperinflation would destroy the middle class. They knew that privatizing state assets would hand control of their economies to foreign corporations. But they also knew something else. They knew that default was considered a mark of shame. In the world of international finance, there is a hierarchy. At the top are the countries with AAA credit ratings. These are the nations that always pay their debts. They are invited to the G7 meetings. They are treated with respect. Their leaders are called statesmen. At the bottom are the countries that have defaulted. They are called banana republics. They are mocked in the financial press. Their leaders are called populists and demagogues. They are excluded from the club. And for the Latin American elite, the educated technocrats who had studied at Harvard and Oxford, who spoke English and wore Italian suits, being excluded from the club was unbearable. They had spent their entire lives trying to prove that their countries were modern and sophisticated. They wanted to be taken seriously in New York and London. They wanted to sit at the table with the big boys. Default would mean admitting failure. It would mean losing face. So they chose the banks over their people. Let me give you a specific example. In Mexico, President Miguel de la Madrid took office in 1982. He inherited a catastrophe. Inflation was at 100%. The peso had collapsed. Capital flight had drained $80 billion out of the country in just 2 years. The IMF came to him and said, "Cut government spending by 15%. De la Madrid knew what this meant. It meant closing rural clinics. It meant laying off teachers. It meant cutting the budget for food programs that kept millions of poor Mexicans alive. But he did it anyway, because the alternative was default. And default would mean that Mexico would be treated like a pariah. The same story played out in Brazil, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in every country that had borrowed during the boom years. The governments slashed spending. They cut salaries. They raised the prices of basic goods like bread and milk. And the people rioted. In 1983, there were bread riots in Sao Paulo. In 1984, there were strikes in Buenos Aires that involved millions of workers. In 1989, there were food riots in Caracas that left 300 people dead. The governments responded with police and soldiers. They beat the protesters. They arrested the union leaders. They tear-gassed the students, all to protect the payments to Citibank and Chase Manhattan. This is what the IMF economists called structural adjustment. But it was not adjustment, it was looting. The governments were transferring wealth from the poorest people in their societies to the richest banks in the world. And they were doing it voluntarily. They were doing it because they believed in the idol of creditworthiness. They believed that if they just kept paying, eventually the crisis would pass. Eventually the banks would start lending again. Eventually growth would return. But that day never came, because the debt kept growing faster than the economy. Between 1982 and 1989, Latin America paid back $240 billion in interest. But at the end of those 7 years, they owed more than they had at the beginning. The debt had grown from $327 billion to $420 billion. They had paid and paid and paid, and they were deeper in the hole than ever. This is the prestige trap. You sacrifice everything to maintain your reputation. You starve your own people to prove that you are responsible. You destroy your economy to prove that you honor your contracts. But the people you are trying to impress do not respect you. They see you as weak. They see you as desperate, and they squeeze you harder. The Brazilian economist Celso Furtado said it best in 1985. He said, "We have become a civilization that works for the banks. Our factories produce not for our people, but for export to pay interest. Our farmers grow not food for our children, but cash crops to earn dollars. Our doctors and engineers emigrate not because they want to, but because there are no jobs here. We have ceased to be a nation. We have become a debt-servicing mechanism. And the tragedy is that it did not have to be this way, because there was always another option. Default. Walk away. Tell the banks, we cannot pay and we will not pay. Restructure the debt on our terms or get nothing." Some economists were screaming this from the rooftops. They were saying, the banks made bad loans, let them take the loss. But the technocrats would not listen, because they were more afraid of being excluded from the club than they were of their own people starving. This is how financial colonialism works. You do not need to send gunboats. You just need to convince the local elite that let me take you inside a room where the fate of a nation was decided. The year is 1982. The place is Los Pinos, the official residence of the President of Mexico. José López Portillo sits at his desk. He is a man who once promised his people that their only problem would be managing abundance. He had told them that Mexico was rich beyond imagination. He had said that the oil beneath their feet would make them a first-world nation. Now, just 4 years later, he is staring at a document that says, Mexico is bankrupt. Across from him sits his finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog. Silva Herzog is an economist trained at Yale. He is calm, technical, precise. He has prepared a presentation with charts and graphs. He slides a single page across the desk. It is a spreadsheet. At the top it says, government revenue, $30 billion. Below that, debt service payments, $15 billion. Half of everything the Mexican government collects in taxes must go to foreign banks. Silva Herzog says, Mr. President, the math is clear. We cannot pay. López Portillo does not look at the paper. He says, we will find a way. We always do. Silva Herzog shakes his head. He says, there is no way, sir. We have already borrowed everything we can borrow. The banks will not lend us another dollar. López Portillo slams his hand on the desk. He says, then we will use our reserves. Silva Herzog says, we have no reserves. The central bank is empty. Capital flight has drained us dry. There is a long silence. López Portillo stares out the window at the gardens. He says, what are you suggesting? Silva Herzog takes a breath. He says, we must declare a moratorium. We must tell the banks that we cannot make the payments. We must restructure the debt. López Portillo turns to face him. His voice is ice. He says, you want me to default? Silva Herzog says, I want you to survive. López Portillo stands up. He says, do you know what default means? It means we become a pariah. It means we are cut off from the world. It means we are no better than some tin-pot dictatorship in Africa. Silva Herzog says, with respect, Mr. President, we are already cut off. The money is flowing one direction, out. We are bleeding to death. López Portillo says, we are not a banana republic. We are Mexico. We honor our commitments. Silva Herzog pulls out another document. He says, then let me show you what honoring our commitments looks like. He reads from the page. To make the debt payments, we must cut the education budget by 40%. We must close half of the rural health clinics. We must eliminate the food subsidy program that feeds 12 million people. We must fire 200,000 government workers. We must freeze wages while inflation is running at 100%. He looks up. He says, that is what honor costs. López Portillo does not respond. Silva Herzog continues. He says, the people are already rioting. When we announce these cuts, there will be blood in the streets. The military may not be able to contain it. López Portillo walks to the window. He says quietly, and if we default? Silva Herzog says, the banks will scream. The IMF will condemn us. The Americans will be furious. But we will survive. We will keep our schools open. We will keep our hospitals running. We will feed our people. López Portillo turns around. He says, and in 5 years? In 10 years? Who will lend to us then? How will we grow? Silva Herzog says, we will grow by using our own resources. We will grow by investing in our own people instead of paying tribute to New York. López Portillo shakes his head. He says, you do not understand. This is not just about money. This is about who we are. If we default, we admit that we failed. We admit that we are not ready to sit at the table with the developed nations. We admit that we are still a third world country. Silva Herzog stands up. He says, Mr. President, we are a third world country, and pretending otherwise is killing us. López Portillo's face hardens. He says, I will not be the president who destroyed Mexico's credit. I will not be remembered as the man who surrendered. We will pay. Silva Herzog says, then you will be remembered as the man who starved his people to impress bankers who despise you. There is a moment of terrible silence. Then López Portillo says, get out. Silva Herzog gathers his papers and walks to the door. As he reaches for the handle, López Portillo says, wait. Silva Herzog turns. López Portillo says, how long can we keep paying? Silva Herzog says, 3 months, maybe 4. Then we will run out of dollars completely. Then we will have no choice. López Portillo nods slowly. He says, then we have 3 months to find a miracle. Silva Herzog says, there is no miracle coming, sir. López Portillo says, there is always a miracle. Mexico does not fail. But he is wrong. On August 12, 1982, just 2 months later, Silva Herzog flies to Washington. He meets with the U.S. Treasury Secretary and the head of the IMF. He tells them Mexico cannot pay. It is the first time in modern history that a major debtor nation has admitted insolvency. The announcement sends shockwaves through the global financial system. Within weeks, Brazil announces it cannot pay. Argentina announces it cannot pay. Venezuela announces it cannot pay. The entire continent is defaulting. But it is not a revolutionary act. It is not a declaration of independence. It is a surrender, because the governments do not walk away from the debt. They beg for mercy. They accept even harsher terms from the IMF. They agree to even deeper cuts. They agree to sell off their state-owned companies to foreign corporations. They agree to open their markets completely. In exchange, they get just enough new loans to avoid total collapse. They get to keep paying. López Portillo's presidency ends in disgrace. He leaves office with an approval rating of 12%. In his final speech, he does something unexpected. He cries. He stands before the nation and weeps. He says, "I am sorry, I failed you." But he did not fail by accident. He failed because he chose his pride over his people. He failed because he believed that reputation mattered more than survival. He failed because when the moment came to choose between the banks and the streets, he chose the banks. And millions of Mexicans paid the price. This scene repeated in every capital city in Latin America. Different presidents, different finance ministers, same choice, same result. Vanity over arithmetic, prestige over people, the illusion of sovereignty over the reality of survival. And the banks won. Now let me show you what happens when an entire continent is forced to pay tribute. Let me show you what systemic extraction looks like in human terms. In 1982, the average wage in Mexico City could buy 30 kilograms of beans. By 1985, that same wage could buy 8 kilograms. The money did not disappear. It was transferred from the pockets of workers to the vaults of banks. This was not a natural disaster. This was engineered poverty. Between 1982 and 1989, Latin America sent $240 billion north. That is more than the entire Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. But this money was not rebuilding anything. It was pure extraction. And the mechanism of extraction was simple. To make the debt payments, governments had to earn dollars. To earn dollars, they had to export. To export more, they had to suppress domestic consumption, which meant cutting wages, cutting social spending, and devaluing the currency. Let me walk you through what this looked like on the ground. In Brazil, the government cut the health budget by 60% between 1982 and 1984. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Antibiotics, bandages, anesthesia, all gone. Doctors were performing surgery with equipment that should have been thrown away years earlier. Infant mortality, which had been declining for 2 decades, suddenly spiked upward. In 1983 alone, an estimated 50,000 additional children died because clinics had closed or run out of medicine. But Brazil made its debt payment on time. Citibank received its interest. In Argentina, teachers went on strike because they had not been paid in 3 months. When the government finally paid them, inflation had eroded the value of their wages by 70%. A teacher who made enough to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in 1981 could only afford a single room by 1984. University professors were driving taxis at night to feed their families. Engineers were leaving the country by the thousands. The brain drain was so severe that entire departments at universities had to close because there was no one left to teach. But Argentina made its debt payment. Chase Manhattan received its interest. In Mexico, the food subsidy program that had kept the price of tortillas affordable was eliminated. The IMF had demanded it. The price of corn flour tripled overnight. For a family earning minimum wage, buying enough tortillas to feed their children now consumed half their income. Malnutrition rates exploded. In rural areas, children stopped growing. Doctors documented an entire generation that was physically stunted because they did not have enough calories during their developmental years. But Mexico made its debt payment. Bank of America received its interest. In Peru, the government stopped maintaining the roads. Bridges collapsed. Highways crumbled. The Pan-American Highway, which had connected the entire continent, became a dirt track in some places. Trucks carrying food from farms to cities broke down. Food rotted before it could reach the markets. Prices spiked even higher. But Peru made its debt payment. In Venezuela, despite sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, gasoline was rationed. The state oil company, PDVSA, was ordered to maximize exports and minimize domestic supply. Every barrel of oil sold domestically was a barrel that could not be exported for dollars, and dollars were needed to pay the banks. So Venezuelans waited in lines for hours to fill their tanks while their oil was shipped to refineries in Texas. But Venezuela made its debt payment. Now let me show you the other side of the equation. Capital flight. When people lose faith in their currency, they try to move their money somewhere safe. The rich move first. In Mexico, between 1980 and 1982, an estimated $80 billion left the country. That is more than the entire national debt at the time. Mexican elites were moving their money to American banks, buying property in Miami, opening accounts in the Cayman Islands. They knew what was coming. They saw the spreadsheets. They understood the math. So they got out. But the poor could not get out. They did not have dollars to move. They did not have foreign bank accounts. They were trapped. When the peso collapsed, their savings evaporated. A middle-class family that had saved for 20 years to buy a house suddenly found that their savings could not even buy a used car. Life insurance policies became worthless. Pensions became jokes. An entire generation's accumulated wealth was wiped out in less than 2 years. And the money? Much of it ended up in the same banks that were demanding debt payments. The Mexican elite deposited their flight capital in Citibank branches in New York. Citibank then turned around and used that capital to demand payment from the Mexican government. It was a closed loop of extraction. The resources flowed out. The debt stayed in. By 1985, economists started using a new term to describe what was happening. They called it negative net transfer. Here is what that means. In a normal economy, rich countries lend to poor countries to help them develop. The money flows from north to south. But in the 1980s, the flow reversed. Poor countries were sending more money to rich countries than they were receiving. Latin America was financing North America. Between 1982 and 1989, the net transfer from Latin America to the developed world was over $200 billion. That is equivalent to 5% of the region's GDP every single year for 7 years. Imagine if the United States had to send 5% of its entire economy to China every year. Imagine the collapse in living standards. Imagine the riots. That is what Latin America endured, and they called it the lost decade. But it was not lost, it was stolen. Growth rates collapsed. In the 1970s, Latin America had been growing at 5% per year. In the 1980s, growth was negative. Per capita income in 1989 was lower than it had been in 1980, an entire decade of progress erased. But the human cost went beyond statistics. Crime rates exploded. When people cannot feed their families through legal means, they turn to illegal means. Kidnapping, robbery, drug trafficking all skyrocketed. Entire neighborhoods became war zones. Police forces were overwhelmed and underfunded. The state was collapsing. Political instability followed. In Argentina, there were multiple coup attempts. In Peru, the Shining Path insurgency grew from a fringe movement to a full-scale civil war. In Colombia, drug cartels became more powerful than the government. In Brazil, hyperinflation hit 2,000% in 1989. The currency was changing so fast that supermarkets had employees walking the aisles with pricing guns, updating prices every hour. People would run into stores and buy everything they could carry because their money would be worth less tomorrow than it was today. This was the systemic withdrawal. This was what debt service looks like when it becomes the organizing principle of an economy. Everything else gets sacrificed. Health, education, infrastructure, security, all of it destroyed to keep the payments flowing north. And the architects of this system, the IMF economists and the bankers and the US Treasury officials, they called it adjustment. They said it was temporary pain for long-term gain. They said that if Latin America just tightened its belt and honored its commitments, eventually prosperity would return. But prosperity never returned because the system was not designed to help Latin America recover. It was designed to extract every last dollar before the corpse stopped twitching. And it worked. By 1987, it had become undeniable. The debt could never be repaid. Every economist who looked at the numbers came to the same conclusion. The math did not work. Latin America owed $420 billion. Their economies were shrinking. Their currencies were collapsing. They were paying interest with borrowed money. It was a Ponzi scheme that had run out of new investors. Something had to break. In February 1987, Brazil's new president, José Sarney, stood before Congress and made an announcement. He said, "We are suspending interest payments on our foreign debt." The room erupted. This was not a default in the traditional sense. Brazil was not saying it would never pay. It was saying, "We cannot pay right now. We need time." But the symbolism was enormous. Brazil was the largest debtor in the developing world. If Brazil could walk away, even temporarily, others would follow. Within weeks, Argentina announced it would limit debt payments to a fixed percentage of export earnings. Peru announced it would cap payments at 10% of government revenue. Ecuador stopped paying altogether. The cascade had begun. But the banks did not panic, because they had already been preparing for this moment. In 1987, Citibank announced that it was setting aside $3 billion in loan loss reserves. This was an accounting maneuver that allowed them to write down the value of their Latin American loans without technically admitting the loans were worthless. Other banks followed. Chase, Bank of America, Morgan Guarantee. All of them quietly took the hit. Their stock prices barely moved, because by 1987 the banks had already extracted more than they had originally lent. Remember, between 1982 and 1987, Latin America had paid back $140 billion in interest alone. The banks had made their money. The defaults were just the final paperwork, but for Latin America, the betrayal was complete. They had sacrificed an entire generation. They had starved their people, closed their schools, and gutted their infrastructure, all to maintain their creditworthiness, all to prove they were responsible borrowers, and in the end, it meant nothing. The banks wrote off the loans anyway. The credit rating agencies downgraded them anyway. The investment disappeared anyway. They had played by the rules, and the rules had destroyed them. In 1989, U.S. Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady introduced a new plan. It was called the Brady Plan. The idea was simple. Latin American countries would exchange their old loans for new bonds at a reduced value. If you owed $100 million, you could trade it for a bond worth $60 million, 40% forgiveness. The banks would take a loss, but they would get some of their money back. The governments would get debt relief, but they would still owe billions. It was presented as a grand compromise, a win-win solution, but it was a fraud. Because the debt forgiveness was conditional. To get access to the Brady Plan, countries had to agree to even more structural adjustment. They had to privatize their state-owned companies. They had to open their economies completely to foreign investment. They had to deregulate their financial sectors. The banks were trading debt for ownership. They were converting loans into equity, and the governments, desperate for any relief, accepted. Between 1990 and 1995, Latin America sold off its crown jewels. Mexico privatized its telephone company, its banks, its airlines. Brazil sold Petrobras, Vale, and its electrical utilities. Argentina sold everything that was not nailed down. American and European corporations bought these assets. The telephone company of Mexico, which had taken 50 years to build, was sold to Carlos Slim for $1.7 billion. Within 10 years, it was worth $40 billion. The oil fields of Venezuela, which belonged to the people, were leased to ExxonMobil and Shell. The copper mines of Chile, the lithium deposits of Bolivia, the forests of Brazil, all sold to pay debts that could never have been repaid in the first place. This was the final liquidation, not just of debt, but of sovereignty. Latin America had been repoed. The banks had foreclosed on an entire continent, and the new owners were moving in. The dream of development was over. The dream of independence was dead. What remained was a hollowed-out shell, a territory that produced wealth for others, a people who worked but did not prosper. The system had been perfected. They called it neoliberalism. But it was just colonialism with a different name, and it is still running today. There are two Latin Americas in history, the one that existed before October 6, 1979, and the one that exists after. Before Volcker, Latin America was rising, poverty was falling, life expectancy was climbing, literacy was improving, the trajectory was clear. After Volcker, that trajectory snapped. 40 years later, the region still has not recovered. The GDP per capita in most Latin American countries is barely higher today than it was in 1980. An entire generation was sacrificed. 2 generations, actually. The children who grew up malnourished in the 1980s are now adults who cannot compete in the global economy. Their children are inheriting the same poverty. This was not an accident of economics. This was a policy choice. Paul Volcker chose to save the dollar by raising interest rates. The banks chose to enforce the debt contracts rather than forgive them. The IMF chose extraction over development, and Latin American elites chose their status over their people. Every step was deliberate, and the lesson is this: interest rates are not neutral. They are a weapon. When a hegemon raises rates, it does not just affect inflation at home. It liquidates entire regions abroad, and we are watching it happen again. In 2022, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 0 to 5% in less than 18 months. the fastest increase in 40 years. Developing nations from Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Ghana are now facing debt crises. The same script, the same IMF missions, the same austerity demands. The guillotine has been raised again, and this time it is not just Latin America in the crosshairs. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme scheme is written in debt contracts. I'm John. This is the Cinematic History Tales channel. If you recognize these patterns in today's headlines, you already know what comes next. Empires liquidate in silence before they collapse in noise. Subscribe now, because the next continent to be repoed might be the one you live on.